This video is on the objective. Differentiate between type 1 and type 2 errors when performing a hypothesis test. All right, this is the second video on this, so if you haven't watched number 1, please do. And I'm just going to go over here right now again, a refresher, a reminder of what these errors are. These mistakes that you could possibly make when performing a hypothesis test. So I had this written up last video as well. So remember, a type 1 error in a hypothesis test is when you reject the null hypothesis, but you shouldn't have. You conclude that the alternative hypothesis is correct, but in actuality, the null hypothesis was the correct, the correct statement. So you reject the null hypothesis, but the null hypothesis was actually true and you shouldn't have rejected it. That's a type 1 error. And this value alpha, right, remember the significance level or the area of the rejection region, when you're talking about testing with critical values and rejection regions. This alpha was also the probability of making this type 1 error. All right, and then you had type 2 error. Now a type 2 error would be that you conclude the null hypothesis is correct, but it isn't, but it really isn't. You don't reject the null hypothesis. You fail to reject the null hypothesis, but you should have rejected it because it is false. So that's another kind of mistake that could be made when performing a hypothesis test. And this value called beta, it's the Greek letter beta, fancy B. This value represents the probability of making this type 2 error. Okay. So here's a question I'm looking at related to this objective in your Newton-Alta homework. Again, if you're unfamiliar with this or want to see more about it, click on More Instruction. Look at their videos, their examples, their notes, and hopefully those help. Alright, so suppose the null hypothesis, H0, is the following statement. So no more than 70% of customers at a sporting goods store do not shop at any other sporting goods stores. So no more than means 70% or less, less than or equal to 70%. But you see how the null hypothesis always involves equals somehow. And then the alternative hypothesis, HA, is the opposite of this. That the sporting goods store claims that more than 70% of its customers do not shop at any other sporting goods store. So this is 70% or equal to 70% or less. This is more than 70%. Now I know they're asking about type 2 error. Okay. But let me go through both of them. A type 1 error would be you conclude the alternate hypothesis, you conclude that more than 70% don't shop at other stores, but the null was actually the true statement. You say the alternate was true, but in fact the null was true. You rejected the null, but you shouldn't have. That's a type 1 error. Now they're asking here about a type 2 error. They talk about beta, remember the probability of making a type 2 error. Now, a type 2 error, as I've mentioned, is you conclude that the null hypothesis is correct, but it actually isn't. You conclude that the null hypothesis is correct, but in fact, in actuality, the alternate is correct, or the alternative is correct. So that means you didn't reject the null when you should have rejected the null. Alright, so a type 2 error would be this. You conclude the null hypothesis that no more than 70%, 70% or less, no more than 70% of customers don't shop at any other stores, but in actuality, more than 70% do shop at other stores, right? So you concluded the null, but you shouldn't have. The actual true statement is the alternate. All right, so let's read through these and see which one says that. So beta here is the probability that the sporting goods store can conclude that more than 70% of its customers do not shop at other stores, when in fact more than 70% of its customers do not shop at other stores. I mean, these are the same statement, so it doesn't make any sense. How about this one? The probability that the sporting goods store can conclude that more than 70% of its customers do not shop at other stores. Right, you conclude the alternate, but in fact, no more than 70%. This is the null, and that's actually true. So this is saying they conclude the alternative hypothesis when in fact the null hypothesis was true. This is a type 2 error. When you conclude the alternative hypothesis is true, but in fact the null was, and you shouldn't have rejected the null. You reject. Oh no, wait. This is a type 1 error. My apologies. Yeah, I'm sorry. This is a type 1 error. Yeah, you conclude the alternative when in fact you should have stuck with the null. So that's rejecting the null when the null was true. That's a type 1 error. My apologies. So this is actually describing alpha, all right, the probability of a type 1 error. This one here, the probability that the sporting goods store cannot conclude that more than 70% of its customers do not shop at any other stores, when in fact no more than 70% of its customers do not shop at any other stores. So this is saying they can't conclude the alternative, but then the null is true. That doesn't make any sense. And this is the probability that the sporting goods store cannot conclude the alternate, meaning they can. All right, so this is the alternate here, that more than 70% do not shop at any other stores. And if they're saying they cannot conclude the alternate, that means they're concluding the null, right? Because you got to conclude one or the other. They cannot conclude the alternate. They conclude the null, but in fact the alternate was true, the null was false. This is type 2 error. You conclude the alternate hypothesis, or the alternative hypothesis, but you shouldn't have. But wait a minute, this is saying, in fact, more than 70%. Yeah, right. Because they're saying here the alternate is true. They should have concluded the alternate, but they didn't. They concluded the null, but they shouldn't have concluded the null. Right? So yeah, this is type 2 error. This is the probability of making a type 2 error. When you conclude the alternate, or I'm sorry, you conclude the null hypothesis, but the alternate hypothesis was actually true. Or you didn't conclude the alternate was true, meaning you concluded that the null was true, but you shouldn't have. Right? It's failing to reject the null when you should have rejected the null. Right? It's concluding the null when you shouldn't have. Okay. So again, some weird wording there, the cans and cannots, but as long as you're getting down to the fact that a type 2 error is the decision not to reject the null hypothesis when in fact it is false. Okay. So in this case, the type 2 error is when the store, doesn't conclude. Again, they're wording it in terms of the alternate hypothesis, the alternative. They can't conclude the alternative hypothesis, meaning they'd conclude, meaning they're not rejecting the null. But the null is actually false, right? They're saying, oh, but that alternative hypothesis is actually true, so they should have rejected it. They should have concluded that. They should have rejected the null in the first place, but they didn't. All right. Yeah, so some weird wording there, but and as long as you get down what a type 2 error is, that should help. Right. And I don't think there's a second part to this. No. Okay, so again, hopefully reading through that, hopefully after this couple videos you're able to distinguish between type 1 error, rejecting the null when you shouldn't have. All right, the null hypothesis is true and the alternate hypothesis is not. In type 2 error, when you don't reject the null, but you should have. All right, the null is false and the alternative is true. But for some reason you kept the null. Right? You made a mistake. So hopefully you can distinguish between those two. And hopefully this video helps and there are more instruction helps and you can get through them. And thank you very much for watching.